Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter,
Brian Chasnoff, reporter.
And this is our first podcast of the 2020s. We took a break for a few weeks, and we're really glad to be back. And one of the big events that's happened in politics while we were gone is the fact that our former mayor, former HUD Secretary Julian Castro, announced last week that he's dropping out of the presidential race. As we record this, the news has just broken that he is endorsing Elizabeth Warren. I think that, all along we've talked about the possibility of a Warren-Castro ticket. What do you guys make of this?
Well, I interviewed him on Saturday.
Right.
And I thought it was interesting that, he talked a lot about anxiety among Democrats right now, in that they don't want to think about anything other than beating Trump. They don't want to think about doing more than that. Really, they just that's their sole goal at this point. When we asked why did your campaign not gain traction, that was one of his answers. Mm-hmm. With Warren, that's doubling down in a way on his strategy for his campaign, which was very progressive, very, very left. So it makes when you take those two together, it makes me wonder, if you don't see the electorate moving in that direction, why endorse Elizabeth Warren? Right?
Well, you saw the two had very sort of friendly relations during the campaign so far, but I think it's going to be interesting to see him deployed as sort of like a campaign surrogate in Iowa, where he was saying that, Iowa maybe shouldn't have the say in, the first say in the Democratic nomination, considering that they don't reflect the makeup of the rest of the country. So I think that's going to produce some interesting dynamics. I'm interested to see how everyone responds to Castro after basically the past several months and weeks that he's been talking about
and
this.
Obviously Texas is a big part of the Super Tuesday vote, and I know he's going to play a part there, because Texas, I think, is going to be a real battle on the presidential side. So we got a lot to look forward to there. And we're really glad on the first podcast of the new year to have a special guest, a candidate for the U.S. Senate. This is going to be one of the most watched races during the primary season and in November. Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez, thank you so much for joining us. You're competing for the Democratic Senate nomination, one of 12 candidates, but certainly one of the candidates who's gotten the most attention.
We are candidate rich in this race.
Now, you've talked a little bit about how, because you've been an activist, an organizer, you founded the Workers' Defense Project, you've founded JOLT, which has been involved in trying to get Latino voter engagement up. And so you've been really involved on that front, but you've never run for political office before. And my understanding is that you kind of had to be recruited and talked into running for the U.S. Senate in this cycle. What was that process like?
So I have run some of our state's largest voting and civil rights organizations, but I have not held political office. I live for changing the politics of Texas, because on every single progressive issue I care about, whether it's climate change or healthcare or immigration or income inequality, I imagine what it would mean to turn a state of 29 million people, the second largest economy in the country, blue, but do that in a way with a real progressive vision of what we're capable of as a state as large as ours. So I was asked a few months back to run by some of the folks that ran Beto O'Rourke's Senate race.
And which people in the campaign?
The folks that ran his digital and field work, so the folks that recruited and oversaw 20,000 volunteers, what really helped us get within 2.6 percentage points of unseating Ted Cruz, and then some of the co-founders of Texas Organizing Project, which here in San Antonio plays real hard politics to get people elected, and in Houston and Dallas asked me to run, and then some folks in the labor movement. And I was not looking to run for Senate. In fact, when they called me at first, I thought they were joking. I said, what do you actually want from me? I thought they wanted to collaborate with my organization, JOLT, on a special project. And at first I said no, and they kept calling me and kept bothering me. And I wanted to make sure at first that they really wanted me to run. I didn't want to run. I'm very progressive, but I didn't want to run just to push other candidates to the left. I have no interest in doing that. I have a beautiful 2-year-old little boy at home who's going to be 3 next week, who I would much prefer to spend time with than doing that. And I felt like I could do that at Jolt. But they kept pushing me because we all know to flip Texas, you need a diverse coalition of voters to come out and vote. But you must turn out more Latino voters and more young voters. And I've been one of the folks that's figured out the secret sauce to do that here in Texas. And you need to be able to inspire people. So I went on a very long walk when they kept bothering me, and I thought it's totally the wrong time for me personally. Because of my son. But it was the wrong time for me personally when I was 24 years old and I started Workers' Defense Project, and I was an undergrad full-time at the University of Texas. And it was the wrong time for me personally when I was 6 months pregnant, and it was the week after the 2016 election, and I launched Jolt at my kitchen table with $5,000. So I thought maybe these are the wrong moments personally that these things happen to me, but they are the right moments in history where I can make a substantial change. So I decided to throw my ring into the hat and then determined to win this race and flip Texas in 2020.
Was part of the persuasion on their part convincing you that this was a winnable race?
Yeah.
I mean, is that one of the things that you had to kind of convince yourself of?
I think they had to convince me. I think, as a Latina, right, that we look around at who's in power, and it doesn't often look like us in this state, especially many of the candidates that represent us statewide. And so I think there was a little bit of self-doubt that I was the right candidate. But I also know from traveling the state that I and who I represent, we are consistently underestimated. And I personally take it as a personal challenge when people underestimate me. I love proving people wrong. And so in this race, I feel like I am running a get out the vote campaign. I'm not running a persuasion campaign. I know that there are millions and millions of voters that are already voting that are Democrats, and millions more that need to vote, but they need to be inspired, they need to be heard, and they need to feel like someone fights for them. And that is something I know how to do.
Do you think the Ted Cruz, Beto O'Rourke face-off, was that lightning in a bottle just due to Ted Cruz and his unique characteristics, or is that transferable, that sort of energy transferable to this race as well?
I think it's fascinating, right? I think Beto was a unique, charismatic candidate. There have been 2 theories about how you win in Texas. There has been the theory that has been tested over the last 20 years and nearly failed and taken us much further from winning every single time, which is you run a persuasion campaign, you run a campaign where you swing Republican white voters. There are simply not enough of them to win as Democrats. And every time a Democrat has run that race, they've gotten us farther. Beto ran a race where he was actually the most progressive candidate I can remember running statewide, a candidate that also fully embraced the diversity of this state as one of its greatest assets. As a child of an immigrant, I felt fully seen by his campaign for the first time. I didn't feel like he was going to sell out my community in the process and his pathway to victory. I saw him embrace the Black Lives Matter movement and stand up on issues that are often hard for Democrats to talk about in this state. And I think that's why he got as far as he did. And then he went out and really spoke to those voters. Now, you talk about 2020. I meet so many people across the state, and then at Jolt, I actually, I got to know the Beto campaign in my personal capacity. I wrote their plan to get out the Hispanic vote in Texas, which they followed, and part of the way we saw that 250% increase in the Latino vote in Texas. I meet so many people who have no idea who Ted Cruz or John Cornyn is, but they really don't like Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And, I talk about this young man that just joined our campaign, Matthew Lopez. He's 24 years old. He voted for the first time ever in 2018. Mm-hmm. My previous organization registered him to vote. He came on our campaign to be our videographer, and he was like, "Oh, it's so cool I'm on your Senate campaign, Cristina." And then he goes, "But who's John Cornyn?" Right? And we looked up a photo of him. He's like, "I've never seen that guy." And that's the experience of many of the voters that I want to reach. But they are inspired by someone that's willing to fight for them, and also someone that can make them go down the ballot. They know they don't like Trump. They don't like what he says about communities, especially in a state as diverse as ours. But they need someone to help them go down ballot. And when you put next me, someone that's half Mexican, half white, that's much younger than John Cornyn, that represents a new generation, a new sense of who Texas is actually today. I think you get millions of those people to see that a vote against Donald Trump is also voting against John Cornyn and voting for someone like me.
I want to talk a little bit about your own personal history. You mentioned that your mother was Mexican immigrant, right? And I think you've described your father as a kind of an Irish American hippie. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Did I read this right? That your father lived in a commune in Mexico for a little bit? Is that
he was part of a group in the 70s that was
okay? You're right.
They did some things that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a different time.
It was a different era.
Yeah, we know that. So now you were born in Ohio, but you spent some time in the Dallas area when you were young, right? About how long?
Yeah. So my dad graduated from Bel Air High School in Houston, and went to UT Austin, and then he moved to Mexico and traveled around, and that's where he met my mom. I grew up what I say is the perfect trifecta to grow up as an American, which is Ohio, Texas, and Mexico. So we lived for a period in Oak Cliff in Dallas. And then we moved to Ohio, and my parents always told me that I would love Austin, Texas, that I should move back there because I hated winter. I wanted to live in a more diverse community. And so they told me to move back to Austin. And so I packed up a suitcase when I was 21 years old. I didn't know a single soul in Austin, and I moved with one suitcase and have stayed ever since.
This is one of the things that amazes me when I look at your personal your biography is that, as you mentioned, at 24 you started the Workers' Defense Project, and you were still going to school. And I'm just trying to remember what my thought process was at 24, and I don't think I was anywhere close to having the sort of the drive to take on something like that. And I'm just wondering what it was. I mean, was it something that your parents instilled in you, that you wanted to be engaged in that way, even at such a young age?
Yeah, I feel like I had this great privilege to grow up in a very diverse background. My mom's the oldest of 9 kids from a very poor campesino family in southern Mexico from the state of Michoacan. And then my dad grew up white and middle class. And so I remember growing up in Ohio and going in to meet with teachers or doctors or just even stores. And when I would go in with my mom, people would clearly see we were Mexican. I'm kind of light-skinned, so I can pass either way depending on who I'm with, right? And so people would treat my mom so differently because she was dark-skinned. She spoke English with an accent. And then we'd walk in with my white American dad, and it was just like night and day. And so as a child, I saw that there were different rules for different sets of people, and that they weren't based on anything based on merit, but they were based on certain characteristics that people were born with. And to me as a child, that just struck me as incredibly unfair, that it wasn't right. And my parents taught me that it wasn't right. And they taught me to be proud of who I am and where I come from, and to be able to live in 2 cultures and 2 communities, and to be able to speak to all different kinds of people. So I moved to Texas, and I really wanted to help immigrants because I had seen how hard it was for my mom. And I got involved just translating because I'm bilingual, and that was my first. And I went to these legal clinics where people would come in, and I thought maybe there'll be a few people here. I'd heard that many immigrants would go to work, especially in the construction industry in Texas, and they would go work, and then maybe they would make like $1, $2 an hour. Or most frequently, they wouldn't be paid anything by the end of the work week. They would just be thought because they were immigrants, they didn't have to be paid. Their employers thought that. So I thought maybe there'll be a few people at this clinic. And I went in, and the room was packed. And then the next week I went in, and it was packed again, and with new people. And I just couldn't believe, I still remember the first case I worked on where the employer, when we called them and said, these workers have to make like at the time it was $5.15 an hour, which was the minimum wage then. That you at least have to pay them that. They were making like $1 an hour. And his response was that if they didn't like how they were being treated, they could crawl back to Mexico where they came from. And I just couldn't believe that other human beings treated other human beings that way. But after working on all these cases for several years, I really wanted to get to the root causes, not just helping one person at a time, but why did these things happen in the first place, and how could we change them at a systemic and policy level?
I wanted to get a chance to talk to you a little bit about, this is obviously the big international story of the moment, which revolves around the U.S. Drone strike against Iranian military leader Qasem Soleimani last week. And there's been a lot of discussion since then. This was authorized by President Donald Trump. And a lot of talk in the past few days about whether this, because of Soleimani's stature in Iran, it's almost like a head of state type of status that he had. Whether this amounted to an act of war, and whether President Trump should have been required to receive authorization from Congress in advance of this, or at some point in this process. And this is something that if you were in the Senate now, that obviously you'd be dealing with this directly. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see this as something that there was a need to have congressional authorization before this something like this would happen?
I think anytime we take actions where they will lead to the loss of American lives long term in war, that we need to make sure that we're acting, one, from a place where diplomacy is the first step and war is the last step, and that we need authorization from Congress when we take actions like these. I look at the actions that Trump just took and the fact that we're talking about that this happened in Iraq, where we have been entangled and for years. I remember protesting our invasion in Afghanistan, being a young person. 18 years that we've been there. We've entangled our country long-term by taking impulsive actions, by not using diplomacy, one of our greatest tools, one of our greatest weapons to actually creating peace. And it cost us thousands of American lives. It cost us trillions of dollars we could have been investing at home here in our country. And it cost thousands of Afghani and Iraqi lives. And so I'm very concerned about these very impulsive actions. And I think this is why we need a real change in leadership, especially in the Trump administration, where I see that he tries to govern and the people around him, not just by tweet, but not understanding the role that diplomacy can play in actually creating long-term peace. The last thing I will say is when I think about like John Cornyn and the situation we find ourselves, we have to also talk about why we're entangled in the Middle East. Part of the reason we're entangled in the Middle East is because of oil. We have conceded so much power as a nation to authoritarian dictatorships in the Middle East because we haven't been willing to invest in renewable energy in the state. I want to make sure that part of our foreign policy is looking at how we get ourselves from that dependency where we are allowing these kinds of actions and entanglement to happen. And for me, we're already number one in wind producing energy in the country. I want to make us number one in solar energy as well. And I think that's part of how we come to a place where we have greater peace across the globe.
I want to go back for a second and talk a bit about the 2018 Senate campaign. Something that was widely sort of acknowledged was that Beto O'Rourke was kind of operating outside of the state party infrastructure. How do you see yourself sort of interacting with the state party infrastructure? Do you run kind of as he ran outside of it, or do you think that they're equipped to basically put a Democrat in Cornyn's seat?
You know what I think Beto did is he did two things. One, he tested and tried new strategies. He tested and tried new messaging. Tested and tried new ways to reach out to voters, to engage volunteers, and to get to scale in a state of 29 million to flip it. He also did engage with the party and invested in other people's campaigns and invested in the party. So I think you need to do both. As someone that's always built institutions that have been outside, from Workers' Defense Project, worked in partnership but outside of the labor movement. We tested and tried new strategies. We saw ourselves as innovators and supporters of the existing infrastructure. Similarly, when I look at who Texas is and the voters we need to reach and the issues that I know from having traveled this state, so many times I feel like as candidates too that in the Democratic Party, we have not spoken strongly enough on the issues, the real economic pain and suffering that the majority of Americans feel every single day, especially here in Texas. And you need candidates that are willing to stand up and fight for those issues, fight for the reality that many people feel and experience every single day that they often don't see represented by candidates. And so I think it's both, yes, I'm going to support the party and help them grow because I think that that's critical, but I also think it's critical to be able to speak my truth and do much of the work that I know many Democrats or the party has failed to do at times, like investing in young voters and voters of color. Now they're trying to do that, but I want to make sure that that is a huge part of our strategy to win, is that we get voters engaged that are often thought of as the afterthought and make sure that they're part of the primary strategy from the get-go.
One policy position that you and Beto O'Rourke share concerns gun buybacks, and this is something that he really a position he really took as a presidential candidate. I don't think he talked about it as a Senate candidate, but you have come out in favor of mandatory gun buybacks for assault weapons, and we always hear about Texas is a gun-loving state, and this is always when you're dealing with the issue of guns, it's always a controversial issue, particularly in this state. Could you explain to people who have questions about this how you would implement this or how you would enforce it in asking people to give up the assault weapons that they would already have?
Yeah. So, first off, I really believe we need to protect the Second Amendment. I grew up around guns. In fact, I'm the best shot in my family. I don't mean to brag too much, but, and up until probably 6 months ago, I actually had a gun in my house. And then I decided as my son was getting older and walking more that I didn't want to have it around. But I think that's the right of people to have guns in their homes. Look, I graduated high school the year of the Columbine shooting, not to age myself, but I remember what it was like, that first, most recent mass shooting in a school. And I have waited my entire adult life to see Congress act and do the very basic things that the majority of Americans support: universal background checks, ban assault-style weapons, and instead we've been teaching a generation of young people to learn how to play dead in their classrooms. That seemed like the more logical answer for legislators than enacting these policies. I believe that the best way, especially after what we saw happen in El Paso and Odessa, I do not believe, if you believe in a ban, you see my fellow Democrats in this race, some of them say they believe in a ban on assault-style weapons because we shouldn't be selling weapons of war to the American people. Well, if you believe in a ban, I believe you must believe in a buyback, because these weapons of war, if they don't belong in the hands of civilians, because they can cause massive carnage, they can be stolen from your home, even if you are a law-abiding gun owner, and the human pain and suffering they can cause, then I don't believe we should leave millions of guns in circulation that can cause massive carnage. There are millions of these guns already in circulation in the United States, and I think we need to get them out of our communities so that we can be safe and our children and families can be safe. And we've seen these policies work in other countries.
One of the things that gets talked about a lot with regard to the Senate is just how difficult it is to get anything passed. I think this year I lost track of the number, but a huge number of bills that passed the House and there's been no action in the Senate at all. And even if we had one house controlling both one party controlling both the House and the Senate, the challenge has always been the filibuster rule in the Senate. And so there's been a lot of discussion recently about whether that is something that we should continue with, because it certainly makes it very difficult to get anything passed. Barack Obama had a House and Senate, Democratic House and Senate for the first few years, and even he struggled with that. So I wanted to get your thoughts on whether the filibuster rule is something that is just sort of outlived its usefulness, or it's just become too much of a hindrance to getting legislation passed.
So, when I think about the rules of democracy, right? This is a big question about the filibuster and whether you change them or not. Mitch McConnell has led the Senate in a way, after they've gotten their tax break and all they want is their appointments for judgeships. And besides that, they really don't care about passing policy. That's what I see. And I get asked all the time, how am I going to go and work with Mitch McConnell? And I say, when I was at Workers' Defense Project, I worked with Republican business owners. I worked with folks of all different kinds of backgrounds. I know how to work with people of different opinions where they have common grounds and common interests. However, I do not believe the question is, how do I work with Mitch McConnell? I think the question is, does Mitch McConnell actually want to work with anyone to get policy passed? And the filibuster, I haven't decided whether we should change it or not. I made the commitment when I ran that I would always be honest with people of where I stood on every single issue. But if I was weighing something in the long-term implications of changing the rules, like what happens when, not just for this election cycle.
It can cut both ways.
It can cut both ways. And so I think we have to really weigh and think about the long-term implications, and that's part of the process I'm in. But I do think it's not just about the rules on the filibuster. It's about the rules in our entire democracy. We live in a time where certain elected officials feel more beholden to their donors than the American people. I think democracy has always been a radical idea. Even from when our nation was founded and we only extended the vote to white landowning men, it was still a radical idea that white landowning men could decide who was going to be in charge of the country, that there weren't going to be kings, that there weren't going to be people above the law. And we've had to do a lot as a country to extend the franchise to women, to people of color, to lower the voting age when we were sending people off to war and they were dying and didn't get a vote or say in that. And I think real democracy right now is just as equally as a radical idea, and that's why it's under attack and assault. And so for me, it's about how we change the rules around this, but also how we change the rules about why do we have to register to vote in this country? I think it should be an automatic right that you are already registered to vote. We should have an opt-out system. Why do we have elections that are financed the way we do? We should have publicly financed elections. It would change everything in this country. And why isn't Election Day a national federal holiday? If we want to celebrate our country and what it means and what it stands for, I want what we do on the 4th of July to actually be Election Day, where we celebrate with our families and communities our country.
You talked about publicly funded elections, and I think that there's a lot of merit to that. I guess the thing that I always struggle with is would this apply to all elections? Would it? And obviously, as you're seeing in your race, you got 12 candidates in that race. How would it, in practical terms, would you see something like that play out?
Yeah, you've seen. There's thresholds you create by. A certain amount you have to first raise, and then you get kicked in publicly financed, but then there isn't. You get to keep raising and go beyond that threshold. I believe that my ideas and what I stand for speak to more people in Texas than John Cornyn, without a doubt. And if he and I had the same megaphone, the same voice, I would beat him. But to do that takes money. And people have power long term in this country because they have an unfair playing field where their megaphone, they can buy their ideas and make my voice not heard. They can make the interests of the average and ordinary American people not heard in our democracy because they are funded, financed, and backed by a very corporate and wealthy elite that I do not believe have the same interests as the majority of Americans. So how do we do it? We have to create thresholds, right? I have 12 candidates running in my race. You have to be able to raise a certain amount. You have to be able to get a certain number of volunteers and petitions. There are ways that other people do this in other countries and ways we've done this in the past. So it's not a question of can we do it? Absolutely, we can come up with the threshold. The system we have now is much more insane and unwieldy than any process we could come up with a publicly financed electoral system.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. You've talked about how in 2016 you knocked on doors for Bernie Sanders. Last week I couldn't help but notice that Susan Sarandon, who was a well-known Bernie Sanders supporter, endorsed you. Do you see your success in the primary? Do you see it tied in any way to how well Bernie Sanders does in the presidential primary? I mean, if he does particularly well in Texas, do you think that improves your chances?
Yeah, so I haven't endorsed anyone in this presidential race. In 2016, I knocked on doors for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and then during the general, I did phone banking and knocking on doors for Hillary Clinton. And so I always believe that we get behind the Democratic nominee. I intend on being the nominee in this race, but I also know that if I wasn't, that I would go knock on doors for whoever the candidate was, and especially get out many of the voters that they may not be able to get out given my background. I have always said, when you ask, where do my policies stand? Obviously, my policies most align with people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Julian Castro. And I know that what I see across this country is that there is really deep economic harm and pain, and the Democrats don't win if they don't speak to that pain. That it's not enough to say that you're against Trump, but what do you stand for? How are you going to make my life better? Trump was a real threat in 2016. I think Hillary was obviously a million times better candidate, and that's why I went and fought for her to get elected. However, I think that there was a failure to understand that people need big structural change in their lives. I mentioned that 60% of Americans don't have more than $1,000 in savings right now. Well, you get one speeding ticket for some people, or you need to go to the hospital and even you have insurance, you may be set back your entire savings or more. by 2023, 40% of student debt borrowers are going to be in default on their student loans in this country. And we just had Betsy DeVos reject 99% of the applicants that were going to get their federal student loans taken away for the public service that we promised them that if they did it, we would release the debt they owed on their student loans, and that half of the people over age of 55 in this country have $0 in retirement savings. You have to speak to that reality if you're going to win. And I think Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, the two candidates left in this race, truly speak to that. And I think that they have a very good shot at winning because of that.
Well, I think on that note, we're going to wrap things up. Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck in the Senate primary race, and we'll be following that very closely.
Thanks so much for having me.
And for all of you listening, thanks, and we'll catch up with you again next week. Take care.